Good evening. Okay, our topic for tonight is the Sumerian hypothesis, and we're reconsidering Genesis chapter 1 to 12. And we'll have 4 talks. It's about 15 minutes each. After that, we'll have a short break. And if you're interested in more detail, because these 4 lectures, it's very summarily, it's not going into great depth. So if you are interested in the topic, please feel free to go to, for example, my blog, vmcleod.blogspot.com, and you'll find some of the other many articles there that's in much more detail, all of them in English. Okay. So the question tonight before us is, can we still believe the Bible? And I think it's a very relevant question. In our day, more and more people ask the question. And I think in many cases, there's not a sensible answer, or people are not prepared to give a good answer to that question. And I think we should engage with that question in a substantial way. So I've written some essays on that, for example, from a scientific perspective, from a hermeneutical perspective. That's when we consider the Bible as text. That's when interpretation is the major point of entry in our study. From archaeological perspective, from a prophetic perspective, and what we're doing tonight is from an ancient world. We're looking at the Bible from the ancient world from which the text originated. And what I call it is the Sumerian hypothesis. So that's what I would present tonight to you. There are 4 talks. The first one is Sumer and the Bible. Who of you guys have heard about Sumeria? One there. Very few people have heard about Sumer. So I believe that lots of the stuff that I'll be presenting to you tonight will be new. So bear with me. At the end, you'll have time to ask questions. And I'll also give a little bit of background as far as possible in this short time that we have available. Next one would be reconsidering the book of Genesis. Myth, legend, or history. That's the primeval history, chapters 4 to 11, and then evidence or faith. So then we'll look at those in the next few lectures. So we're reconsidering Genesis chapter 1 to 11. So what you'll hear tonight is not the usual way of thinking about these things. I think so many people have read these things, have talked about these things, and have not really thought about these things. That's a big problem. Many Christians read the Bible, and they assume when they read it, they know the text, and they just assume that their way of thinking about it is just how it is. But that's problematic. We'll have to delve a little bit deeper into the text, and that's what we'll do tonight. So Genesis 1 to 11, what is interesting about this, and that's actually also why we're discussing it, is it includes a lot of material from Mesopotamian origin. Now we know that Israel, the people of Israel lived in Canaan, which is quite far removed from Mesopotamia. So the question is, how did that Mesopotamian material ended up in the Bible? That is the question. That's the question I'm going to consider tonight. So where did this material, this Mesopotamian material in the book of Genesis, where did it originate? Okay. Now, there are 3 perspectives. The best known, is the Babylonian hypothesis. The Babylonian hypothesis, you probably won't know it, but by far, most scholars would use that hypothesis in their reading of the text. So they believe that this information were taken from Babylonian sources during or after the exile. That's quite late. You'll see it's about 605 to 536. That's BC, that's the time of the exile. And even after the exile, so post-exilic. So if you hear the word post-exilic, that's after the period of the exile. So many or most scholars believe that this information in Genesis 1 to 11, it was when the Israelites were taken into captivity, and when they came to Babylon, they heard these stories and things, and some of these authors incorporated these stories and this information in the biblical text. The other hypothesis is that, and this is what I'll present tonight, that this information entered the Bible much, much earlier. It happened when Abraham migrated from Sumer, the land of Sumer. He lived in Ur, and Ur were located in Sumer. So when he migrated from Sumer, he brought this information with him. His family brought this information with them, and it was later then the source material was later handed down in their circles and eventually found its way into the Bible. There's also a third view, and this is divine revelation. So some people believe that God dictated all this information to Moses, and that's how it entered the Bible. The reason why I won't consider that in any detail is that it has such a close relation with the Babylonian world that it seems quite logical, and I think, in my opinion, there can't be a real dispute that it originated from that world. Now, the land of Sumer, where was it located? So there's the Fertile Crescent. This is the Middle Eastern world. On the left-hand side, you have the Mediterranean Sea. Here on the right, the Persian Gulf. Now, the land of Canaan was situated there, right on the western edge of the green area. That's the land of Canaan. That's where Israel is, and that's where Abraham migrated. The land of Sumer is right on the eastern edge of this green zone. So it's right here. At that early period, it was right next to the Persian Gulf. These cities were just very close to the Persian Gulf. Today, the ruins are a bit removed. It's about 150 kilometers from the sea because the level of the sea has gone down. So Abraham migrated from here, from Sumer, all the way up towards Haran, and from there, according to the Bible, down to Canaan. So we consider the figure of Abram tonight, and we'll see whether the question before us is also whether he's historical or not. But this is the background for the talk of tonight. So the biblical criticism view. Now, the biblical criticism view, there's a particular way that scholars use when they access the biblical text and think about the biblical text. In biblical criticism, the way of starting this inquiry is to accept a secular approach. So beforehand, it's accepted that we should study the Bible from a scientific perspective, a secular scientific perspective. So that's the background for this study. So it's, in my opinion, slightly problematic because beforehand it already rules out the supernatural and anything that's divine or beyond science. One of the great or important fathers of this field is Julius Wellhausen. He said, and that was already in 1878, in his book, Abraham should not be regarded as a historical person, but rather as a free creation of unconscious art. So for him, Abraham is just a fictional character. It's not something as a person in history. The reason for this way of thinking is that they were very negative about tradition at that stage. The Enlightenment had a great effect on the people, the scholars of Europe, and in their view, tradition should not be trusted. And they had a radical reaction against tradition, especially the biblical tradition, and they said that we cannot believe anything without positive proof. So if there's not positive proof, we cannot believe it. It's called positivism. There must be positive proof before we can believe it. Now, since then, the field has changed a lot. We've learned a lot about archaeology. And today we know that there's so many things in history that we just can't prove because archaeology are not truly an empirical science. We're not sure if we go and dig that what we find is a representation of the true reality in history. So there's an historical reality, and there's the dig, the excavation. And what we find in the excavation is not necessarily a representation, a true representation of reality, because there's a gap that we can't cross. It's impossible to cross. And that's why nowadays I don't think there's academics that at this stage has this view anymore of positive evidence, at least not from a philosophical perspective. So philosophy of science has long ago discarded this way of thinking. Let me take an example. The Great War of Troy. Who of you have heard about this Great War? Who of you have read the Iliad? Is there anybody? Okay. Sophisticated. Yeah. So now, there was a stage in the early study of the Greek world where scholars were of the general agreement that this war didn't happen and that Troy did not exist. And then one day there were a certain scholar, he was not really a scholar, he was just a person that thought by himself, he thinks these stories are true. And he started excavating, and then he found the city of Troy. And it overturned the whole scholarly perspective, and suddenly everybody were on this wagon, and they started excavating all over the Mediterranean Sea. But since that time, there's a lot of dispute about Troy. I visited the ruins of Troy, and there's a lot of dispute whether this war really happened. For example, one of the problems is that a lot of the stones had been removed by the Romans much later. So the question now is, did this war really happen, or is it just a story? And it's such a well-known story. Most of us just believe it happened. But archaeologists are not able to show above all doubt that it really happened and when it happened. So we have a real problem when it comes to these things. So nobody today believes, if we don't find positive evidence, we cannot believe. There are many things, it's in between, and the gray area is much more difficult than that. And that's what I'll argue today. Another more recent scholar, for example, Blenkinsop, he writes that the biblical authors invented the stories of Abram in the post-exilic period for various necessary reasons. So he believes it was in the Persian period, that's about 300 BC. So in his view, the figure of Abram were invented about 300 BC. So there's no historical Abram. There's no such person in history. Now, this, for example, is the view of the theological faculty at the University of Pretoria. If you read the Theo, that's a journal, the official journal. I received it for quite some time, and then you'll see this is their perspective. But luckily, there are also other views, other scholars that hold a different view, and they believe that Abram is indeed historical. So, for example, we have Hofmeyr. He wrote a very interesting book, The Archaeology of the Bible, and he states, the fact that the archaeological evidence has so richly enhanced the patriarchal narratives certainly does lend authenticity to the biblical narratives and makes it more difficult to dismiss the accounts as literary fiction. So what he says, there's a lot of supporting evidence. We can't prove above all doubt that Abram did live, but there's a lot of supporting evidence. And in his view, it's enough to believe in an historical Abram. Okay. What is the problem? Okay, we can. So, what is the evidence for Abram, for an historical Abram? So, you'll see that the Sumerian hypothesis depends on a historical Abram. If there's no historical Abram, there's no Sumerian hypothesis. Then the Babylonian hypothesis is the only game in town. So if we don't believe Abram really lived as a historical person, then we could think that, okay, all these stories that came from Mesopotamia, they came from that world when Israel was taken there during the Babylonian exile and in the time after that. On the other hand, if Abram really lived as an historical person, then we can believe that he brought this information with him when he traveled from Sumeria to Canaan. And it was handed down in his family. Now, what is the evidence? Recently discovered cuneiform texts confirm that the Elamite campaign into Syria really did happen. Reference to that campaign is in Genesis chapter 14. And there was a long time where there was no evidence for this campaign, but some time ago, archaeologists found some tablets with cuneiform tablets. When they read it, they see, okay, this campaign did happen. It did happen in the time that the Bible places Abraham, and the incursion were deep into Syria, and then most probably, as the Bible says, also as far as the Dead Sea. It happened during the reign of the Elamite king Sive-Palahupak. His brother was Kuduzulu, who ruled in Isnuna in Sumer. And for that reason, I think one can assume that he was probably the one that led the incursion into northern Syria. Now, what is interesting is the root of the first part of the name Kuduzulu, Kudu, the KD. Now, why I say the root is the vowels are not that important because that changes with time. And one often finds, for example, in the ancient Hebrew that the vowels were not even included in the writing. So what's important is the consonants, K and D. And that corresponds with that of the king that's mentioned in the Genesis story, leading this incursion, Kedorlaomer, which is also KD. Okay. That's not proof, but it's supportive evidence. More evidence. There's also Abram's visit to Egypt. After Abram traveled from Haran to Canaan, there was famine in the land, so he proceeded to Canaan. Now what is interesting, there's a depiction at Beni Hassan in Middle Egypt, where we find in the tomb of Khnumhotep II, he was the administrator of the Eastern Desert, and the person that is depicted there, some Asiatics, that's just Semites, it's the kind of people that Abram belonged to, and their leader has the name of Abishur. Now Abishur is just of the same Amorite name type than Abram. So one could say, for example, in Afrikaans we have a name Jacobus, but in English we'll have James. It seems like two different names, but it's just the same name. So it's the same kind of thing, I think, that we have when we talk about Abishur and Abram. Now, they are called Asiatics of Shu. Now, the land of Shu, where this Abishur originated or came from, it refers to the southern Levant. I'll just show you now where it is, and most scholars believe that it refers to the region east of the Jordan. And that's exactly where Abram came from when he moved towards Egypt. Okay. So this is the beautiful depiction in the tomb of Khnumhotep II. What is also interesting is the robes. The colorful robe pattern with stripes and chevrons, as one author calls it, worn by Abishur and his family. It reminds of the robe mentioned in the Bible in connection with Joseph. So I think when we look at this, it's very much what those people wore. It's a good representation. So this is, I think, very close to the robe that Joseph wore according to the Bible. So here is the land, the Levant. Usually it's just, in most generally, it's used to refer to the Canaan and the wider area around Canaan, but more specifically, the land of Shu. It refers to the land east of the Jordan. So Abram came from Sumer to Haran, and he came there from the eastern side of the Jordan, went to Egypt. So the Egyptians said the land, he came from the land of Shu. Abishur came from the land of Shu, beyond the Jordan. That's exactly the land where Abram came from. There are more evidence. Khnumhotep II had close ties with the royal court, and Abram's coming to Egypt was also noted at the royal court, according to the biblical story. We also find that Abishur is described as a ruler of the hill lands. Now, hill lands is just another name for Canaan. At that stage, it were not called Canaan in Egypt, it was called the hill lands. Now, Abram is also described in the Bible as a mighty prince from Canaan. So we have the same kind of descriptions. What about dates? Now, in an article entitled A New Ancient Middle Eastern Chronological Model in the Journal for Semitics, it's to be That's been accepted. It's one that I wrote, but it's not yet been published. I argue that the Mesopotamian high chronology aligns with the Egyptian low chronology. This chronological model has a certain kind of power in showing why certain things in the history of Egypt happened. It explains things that other models cannot happen or cannot do. So in that sense, I believe it's a good model. But in these things, what I'm trying to present is a good and sensible narrative. I'm not arguing that this is the only correct way to view these things. We can't do that. I've already shown that. So Abishur arrived in the 6th year of King Senusert. That was, according to this model, in 1836 BC. Now, according to the Bible, in the Septuagint, that's the Greek translation of the Bible going back to the 3rd century BC. This also happened in exactly the same year, 1836. And St. Paul also uses this date in Galatians chapter 36, because in the Septuagint it reads that from the time that Abram migrated from Haran and the fathers lived in Canaan, and Israel moved down to Egypt, until the exile is for 430 years. And St. Paul says that since from the time of the promise to the law is 430 years. It's exactly the text that he is also using. That date is exactly 1836, exactly the same date. Now, the Elamite incursion, according to this model, is slightly later, 1822. It fits very nicely with the biblical information. So the key points, Sumer and the Bible, regarding Abram and the historicity of Abram. The Abram story is in perfect agreement with archaeological data. There's nothing in conflict with the biblical story. We cannot prove that Abram is historical. We can prove very little from that early period. So that's not actually the point. But we can make a good and a viable case for an historical Abram, on which the Sumerian hypothesis, which I'll present in the next 3 short lectures, is based. Abram, if he indeed lived, the most logical conclusion is that he brought the stories of Genesis 1 to 11 from Ur to Canaan, and that's what I'll argue for in the next 3 lectures. Okay, so let's proceed. We are considering the Sumerian hypothesis and reconsidering Genesis chapter 1 to 12. Now, the first talk was on Sumer and the Bible. The second one is reconsidering the book of Genesis. So what we'll consider in this part is the outline. We'll look at the creation story, the garden story, and a little bit about the primeval history. Now, what is interesting about the creation story that's in Genesis 1 is there's a remarkable amount of Sumerian ideas within this biblical passage. For example, heaven and earth, that's just a Sumerian term referring to the cosmos. So we don't have to try and understand why it's heaven and earth. There's a long history behind that, but it comes from Sumer. The deep, we read about the deep. There were only the deep, that's the primeval waters. Now that corresponds with the Apsu in Sumerian tradition. It's very much the same, it's the primeval waters. And we find in a text, for example, in Kin and Ma, that heaven and earth were created from the Apsu. So it's very much what we find in the biblical narrative, God creating heaven and earth, but originally they were only the primeval waters. We read that God created light. That was the first thing created, was light. In the same way, in the Sumerian tradition, we find Gibel, that's brilliance, that appeared in the Apsu, in the primeval waters. Creating the dry ground from the waters, that's what we find in the Bible, God creating the dry ground. That's a very, very typical Sumerian motive. The firmament, or heaven, it's a dome-shaped vault of heaven, is also an ancient Sumerian idea. In this lectures, I'm not talking about the ancient worldview, but obviously they had a radically different way of thinking about the world than we have today from the scientific perspective. A totally different way of thinking, which was not wrong, but it was away from the observer. So how the observer viewed the heavens. So if you view the heavens from the standpoint of the observer, you'll see tonight that the Orion is about, at this stage, right above us. Later tonight, it will move towards the west, slowly but steadily. Over time, you'll see it actually moves in a circle around the Earth. It seems like that. And towards the north and the south, this circle gets smaller, and there's a particular point right in the north and right in the south that just stands still. Everything turns around. It seems the heavens turns around this particular stated point. So it looks like a big egg, a cosmic egg. So the northern part also looks at the same time like a dome. So this is where the idea of the dome comes from. So it's not wrong, it's just the observation that the heavens look like this. The creation of the sun on the fourth day, that's one of the great enigmas of the biblical account. What we find in Sumerian tradition is in fact that the sun also appears relatively late on the scene. So we have very much the same way of presenting creation in the Sumerian and in the biblical accounts. So there's a close correspondence with the ancient Sumerian tradition. You see, in the previous lecture, I showed you where Sumeria was on the eastern edge of the Middle Eastern world, just close to the Persian Gulf. So there were the ancient Sumerian tradition that were located in that area, the same area that Abram came from. So we believe, and this is what I'm arguing for, that he brought, when he came from that area, this were the worldview, the way of thinking. And that's why we find it in the source material that was later used by the biblical author, and that's how it entered the biblical narrative in Genesis 1. So this suggests that the author of the book of Genesis used source material originating from this milieu. This reflects this milieu in ancient Sumer. So the Sumerian world molded the thinking of the person or persons who wrote the source material used by the biblical author. So if the biblical author was Moses, he was from Egypt. Obviously, this was not his perspective, but the material handed down by the fathers, which he used to write the text, going back to Abram, that originated from Sumer because that's where Abram originated. The biblical author reworked the ancient motives within an evolving Hebrew tradition. He included the creation of all sorts of plants and animals as well as humans, and he replaced the polytheistic perspective of the Sumerians with a monotheistic view of the Hebrews. But the worldview and the thinking is very much that of the ancient Sumerians. Now what is interesting, these Sumerian motives in the creation story show absolutely no influence whatsoever from developments after the Abrahamic period. So there were a lot of development from the Babylonian period. When Hammurabi became king of Babylon, there were great changes throughout the ancient Middle Eastern world. The Babylonians had their own way of thinking, but none of these ideas is in any way present in Genesis 1. We don't find any glimpse of this later Babylonian perspectives. So this is quite important. So there's no motives that's distinctly from the New Babylonian or New Assyrian period. That's a period of the exile, the Babylonian exile. So if we believe that it was during the exile, the Babylonian exile, that the Israelites encountered these ideas and that the author included it in the writing of Genesis, we have this problem. We have to explain why all these ideas that we find, all these concepts and motives that we find in Genesis 1 go back to the pre-Abrahamic world. Nothing from the Babylonian period at all in this text. There is a view that Genesis 1 were influenced by the Babylonian Enuma Elish. That's the creation epic. That dates from about 1000 BC. Now, the reason for this argument is that the Hebrew word Tehom, the deep, shows some agreement with the sea monster Tiamat. You see the name Tiamat, similar to Tehom. So, and Tiamat is also a representation of the sea. So Tehom here is the primeval waters. So they believe that this shows that this word, there is some correspondence with the monster Tiamat, that we find that plays an important role in the Enuma Elish. The problem is that this proves nothing because these ideas were around already in the Akkadian period, long before Abraham. Tiamat originated in the Akkadian period. That's the end of the 3rd millennium BC. That's about 400 or 500 years before Abraham. So that's absolutely, it's not a good argument. Nothing like the complicated creating motives typical of the Babylonian creation story. For example, the war between the older and the younger gods, generation of gods, or the creation of the world from the body of Tiamat, Marduk, killing Tiamat, cutting its body in pieces, creating the world from those pieces. There's nothing at all of any of these complicated ideas in the biblical narrative. So although there are clear Mesopotamian influences, these are typical of the early Sumerian traditions. That's the world of Abraham and the forefathers. And his forefathers, actually. So it's very, very ancient, while they were still living in ancient Sumeria. So here's just a depiction from a later period showing Tiamat. Here is the Tiamat monster. And you'll see over here is Marduk, the great Babylonian god, fighting and killing Tiamat, as we find in this story, this creation story. Let's go to the garden story, Genesis chapter 2. So the main personage of the biblical story is Adam. And that corresponds with the similarly named Adapa of Sumerian tradition. So we have a very similar figure than Adam of the Hebrew tradition in the Sumerian tradition. The first known human with whom God had relation, that's also what we hear about Adapa. Adapa was also the founding sage of Sumerian creation, the first human with whom the supreme God, which corresponds with the biblical or the Semitic had a relationship. Adapa was misled by the Sumerian god Enki, sometimes described also as a snake, regarding the food of life, in the same way that Eve was misled by the snake regarding the food of the tree. So we have very similar motives in these stories. In both cases, God or a god prevented them from eating from the food or the tree of life. So I think there can't be any doubt that these two stories had a similar, or at least maybe the same, I would argue for the same origin, but it evolved in different ways. Also in the garden story, we find God is depicted as a potter. This is a metaphor, God depicted as a potter. He made Adam from the soil. That's not all. The animals and the birds were also made from the ground. Now in Genesis 1, in the creation story, we find that God has already made the trees and the animals. Now again, he recreates them. So that's why there's a belief that it's a second creation story. In my view, that's not correct. This is a garden story, but underlying the garden story is the metaphor of God as potter. That is the underlying, throughout this garden story, that is the underlining line that we should pick up there. What is also interesting is Eve made from Adam's rib. Now that is a story well known from Sumerian tradition. Also, it was reworked from a well-known Sumerian story. So the biblical author, when he wrote this, he used a well-known Sumerian story when he said that Eve were created or were made from Adam's rib. So why would he say that? Why would he use a well-known story? Because for him it's just a metaphor. In that ancient period, the narrative, the story, and the metaphor were closely interrelated. And the language tools were not yet clearly distinguished. So in our days, we have a clear, this is the narrative, this is the story, this is the metaphor, this is the symbol. But for them, these things are intermingled. All the ancient literature, it's not only in the Hebrew text, show the same, very same characteristics. So why we know that this is just a metaphor is it's also found in the other story. And that's of Enki's creation of 8 other gods and goddesses from his own body. One was the virgin goddess, and she was called Ninki. In the Sumerian text, the name means Lady Rib. but in the Sumerian text there's a play on words. It actually means also lady life. This is exactly what we find regarding Eve. You see, Eve was taken from Adam's rib, but her name is then later on said to mean life. So we have exactly the same motive in Genesis that we find in the Sumerian story. So what the author does, he just used this metaphor and he wants to say something that's a close relationship between man and wife. So let's look further at the garden story, chapter 2. The location of the garden was somewhere in the east. The area was it was in the area of the heads, that's the headwaters of the Tigris, Euphrates, Gihon. The Gihon was earlier the Gihon, before it was called the Arrakis after the Islamic invasion of the Caucasus. And the Pishon, that's not the Ushun, you'll just immediately see the last part is the Ushun. And here we have these 4 rivers, all of them originated around this area in the northern Zagros. So that's where the Bible in Genesis places the Garden of Eden, somewhere in the northern Zagros mountains. Now that's exactly where the ancient Sumerians placed their origins. The Semites, remember, it was not only the Sumerians living in Sumer, there were a lot of Semites also living there. The forefathers of Abram were also living there, so that was also part of their own tradition coming in the early days from the northern Zagros and migrating, as the Bible says, to the land of Shinar. What about the tree in the garden? It's closely associated with the serpent. Now this is a very old motive also that goes back to the earliest strata of Sumerian thought. There are actually 3 different stories where we find this motive in ancient Sumeria. What about the cherubim, the biblical cherubim? We read in the story of the garden that the cherubim played an important role. Is there something similar in Sumeria? In the Sumerian tradition, we have the snake, but we also have the eagle associated with the tree. The eagle was sitting on top of the tree, the snake were at the bottom. And now, interesting in Hebrew poetry, we find that the cherubim has large wings. They have large wings, and we read that God actually rides on a cherubim, so they are very much like eagles. So in my view, the ancient eagles of Sumerian tradition were later called cherubim in the biblical or the Hebrew tradition. What about Genesis chapter 4 to 11, the primeval history? So what we find is genealogical lists of the earliest remembered forefathers, their particularly long lifetimes. There are many that are many centuries long. And then we have short accounts of events related to some of these persons. For example, Enoch. We read about Enoch, and then just a short note sort of which says that God took him to heaven. Some in between the genealogies and some others within the genealogies. Now, a Sumerian background for this is also found in the stories because there's reference to the land of Shinar. That's where they lived. So the Bible actually placed these things, this early history, in the land of Shinar. Now here's the interesting thing. All these characteristics is also found in the Sumerian king list. The king list shows a close agreement with what we find in the book of Genesis. We also find these genealogical lists. We also find the long lifetimes, and we also find these short synopses right throughout the text here and there when a particular person is referred to. Now, the Sumerian king list probably compiled during the reign of King Utu-Hekal of Uruk. That was at the end of the 3rd millennium. That was about, let's say, 300 years before Abraham. So it was before Abraham's period. And so the author, if he came from Sumer, that would have been a text that he knew. That would be the style, the literary style that was available to him. So it makes sense that he copied that same style when writing the Hebrew history. Contain genealogies of early forefathers, some of whom also lived centuries-long lives, as well as short comments about some of these figures. Very much, it's exactly the same characteristics that we find in Genesis chapter 4 to 11. So the key points in reconsidering the book of Genesis, There's a close correspondence between the creation story, the garden story, the primeval history, and Sumerian motives and tradition. That's right throughout. All the main motives throughout the story has an equivalent in ancient Sumeria. The correspondences with Sumerian tradition are comprehensive. They are systematic and they are detailed, as we will see in the next lecture. Insofar as motives, stories, and style are concerned, it's not an ad hoc borrowing. So a late author, if it was from the Babylonian period, then it seems like an ad hoc. There's not this systematic borrowing as we find when we refer it back to the early period. Those believing that it originated in the Babylonian period would say some of these things came from the Greek world. The author just took it from all over the place. What I'm showing is no, all these things originated from exactly the same place, that's Sumer. What is also interesting, as I've said, that these Sumerian motifs show absolutely no influence whatsoever from developments after the Abrahamic period. No motifs that are distinctly Neo-Babylonian or Neo-Assyrian. That's from the Babylonian period, the Babylonian exile. So from that period, there's nothing from that time represented in the text. The striking correspondences with the Sumerian king list strongly suggest that the author of the source material lived during the same period, the period of Abraham. Why would the author, more than 1,000 years later, during the Babylonian period, go and copy the style of a document that's so much older? Usually authors use the same style of their contemporaries. We don't find authors suddenly going back more than 1,000 years to use that same style. It just doesn't happen. We are people of our time. And the Sumerians were people of their time. And these people coming from Sumeria were people of that time. That was that milieu. That was the world from which they originated. That's why these Sumerian motives are underlying all these things, because that was their world in the Sumerian hypothesis. So the most likely hypothesis, in my view, which I'm arguing for tonight, is that the Abrahamic family brought this material from Sumer to Canaan, and that is the Sumerian hypothesis. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're talking about the Sumerian hypothesis, reconsidering Genesis chapter 1 to 12. The question is, can we still believe the Bible? We're considering it from an ancient world perspective, the ancient world from which the biblical text originated. We've already considered Sumer and the Bible. We've reconsidered the book of Genesis, and now we're considering the primeval history. Is it myth, legend, or history? That is the question in this lecture. Okay, so the question is actually on the trustworthiness of Genesis chapter 4 to 11. Can we believe these stories? Is it in some sense historical? Does it go back to true history? Or is it just the kind of stories that we tell around the campfire? What is it? Let's consider it. The genealogies in the book of Genesis incorporate data which also appears in the Sumerian king list. In the previous lecture, we've discussed the Sumerian king list. So most of the stories find a direct equivalent in ancient Sumerian tradition. So the stories that we find in the primeval history in Genesis from chapter 4 to 11 have an equivalent in ancient Sumeria. About all the main figures and the events mentioned in the Hebrew text also appear in the ancient Sumerian tradition. Okay? So what I'm not suggesting is that the Hebrews merely copied the Sumerian tradition. This must be absolutely clear. I don't think they just copied it. What I'm saying is, I propose this suggests that the information belonged to a Semitic tradition handed down by the Abrahamic family, who is said to have come from Ur in Sumer. So it was handed down. That was the world from which Abraham and the forefathers came, And that is why these stories were handed down in this family circles. Later, it were written down in the last lecture. We just consider very shortly consider when it were probably written down, but it were written down as some states as source material and used in by the biblical author. So I do not believe we just directly borrowed from the Sumerian tradition. That's not what I'm saying. So let's have a summary of the biblical text of the pre-biblical history. There's the garden story of Adam and Eve. There's the story of Cain and Abel. That story is not found in this form in Sumerian tradition. There's the story of Enoch, who was taken alive to heaven. Then there's the story of the great flood, the flood here in Noah and the ark. There's the story of Nimrod, who ruled in Uruk and Babel. Uruk is one of the great cities in ancient Sumer. In the early period, it was actually the only great city in ancient Sumer. So when Nimrod ruling in Uruk means he must have been a great Sumerian king. There's no other way to understand this. He also ruled over Babel, and we'll come back to Babel and see what it actually refers to. So the story of the Tower of Babel and the confusion of languages. That's a summary of the biblical pre-biblical history. So let's look at the Sumerian, the correspondence between the Sumerian and Semitic traditions. Corresponding to Adam, I've already discussed that in the first lecture, is the story of Adapa, the earliest remembered person who brought civilization to the land. Then there's the story of Etana, who was taken on the back of the eagle to the abode of the supreme God. He corresponds with Enoch. Then there's the story of the great flood. A flood hero built an ark and survived with his family. That's also found in Sumerian tradition. Then there's the story of Enmerkar, which I argue is none other than Nimrod. And he ruled in Uruk, again in Uruk, but also over Eridu. And I'll argue just now that the biblical Bible is just the same as Eridu. He built Eridu. That was the first time that Eridu was, he built Uruk. It was the first time Uruk was built, and he rebuilt the great temple platform at Eridu in the south. And then there's the story of the confusion of languages. You can immediately see that these stories from ancient Sumeria has a close correspondence with the biblical stories. So there's an agreement between the Sumerian and Semitic traditions. The biblical stories has clear correspondences with those of ancient Sumer. But, now this is extremely important, there's no systematic account of events in this ancient Sumerian tradition similar to that found in the biblical tradition. We have the king list, we have the Sumerian king list, but that's just lists of kings. And the author, all that he did was to list all the various rulers of ancient Sumer, the one after the other. He had no idea when they actually ruled. Many of them ruled at the same time, so he had no idea how this ancient history of Sumer fit together. So what we find, there's no such systematic account of events in ancient Sumerian tradition. To get at such a systematic account, we have to go to the text. We've got to use archaeological material, and we must try and reconstruct ancient Sumerian tradition. Now, we may easily reconstruct Sumerian tradition in such a way, and this is quite interesting, that it is consistent with the biblical account of events. So the way that the one follow on the other in the biblical narrative agrees. When we go today and we reconstruct Sumerian tradition, a viable way of doing that is exactly what we find in the biblical description of things. So this is quite remarkable, because the biblical author did not have a Sumerian outline to work from. So if he lived late, say in the Babylonian period, there's no such outline to work from. So how would he know how correctly to order these various events, the one after the other? How would he know that? So what I'm saying is there's no outline that he was able to use for the compilation of his version of events. So how did the biblical author know how to arrange his history, placing the personages in the correct historical context? The obvious answer is we have an authentic tradition that really goes back to the relevant period. That's the only way that makes sense, how he was able to order his story in such a way that it agrees with viable reconstruction of Sumerian history. Now we're talking about history. That's something we do today. It's extremely difficult to see how a late author from the post-exilic period, that's after the Babylonian exile, would have been able to do that. The ancient history in Genesis 4 to 11 should be taken in exactly the way that it is presented as the prehistoric tradition of the people of Israel that was handed down from generation to generation throughout the ages. I think this is a good argument for that. Now let's consider the personages a little bit more careful. I've already discussed Adapa and Adam, so I won't repeat that. Now Enoch, Enoch was the seventh descendant of Adam. He is said to have been a holy man that was taken alive to the abode of God. Etana, on the other hand, was also a Semite. Abraham and his family were Semites. He was the first king of Kish. The city of Kish is just slightly to the north of Uruk in ancient Sumer. The name Etana means he who went up to heaven, or to An is the name of the supreme God. It just means God. So the story of Etana, he was taken to the abode of the supreme God on the back of an eagle. It's very much the story of Enoch being taken to heaven. So if the eagles of ancient Mesopotamia is just a cherubim of biblical tradition, it immediately makes sense, this kind of story. So let's have a look at Nimrod in Merkar. Nimrod was the son of Cush, the great-grandson of Noah, who survived the great flood. He was a mighty king, a mighty hunter. His kingdom stretched from Babel and Erech. Now, Erech is just Uruk. You can see the E is actually a U. Here we have a good example of the vowels changing a little bit. The E, the U, but we have the R the same, and the sh, da, the K. This is just the same name. It is just Uruk. But in your Bible, you'll probably find Erech. It's just going back to Uruk. That's actually the original name. In the south of Sumer into the north. So his kingdom stretched from the south, from Uruk and from Uruk and Babel, that's now Nimrod, towards the distant north. He's closely associated with the Tower of Babel, and his name is sometimes derived from the Hebrew word marat. He rebelled. So he's closely, Nimrod is in the biblical, actually also the extra biblical tradition of the Jews, closely connected with the Tower of Babel. Now in Merkar, which I say is just the exact equivalent, the historical person in ancient Sumer, was one of the greatest legendary kings in the history of Sumer. The consonants in the first part of the name in Merkar spells NMR. So let's have a look. Forget the vowels. NMR. You see, and that's exactly what we find in Nimrod, NMR. So it can be vocalized as Nimrod in the Hebrew tradition. So that's why we can believe that in Merkar is just another form of the name. Nimrod is just another form of the name in Merkar. This has been first been suggested by David Roll in his books, and I agree with that. The last part of the name, the Kar, may be read as hunter, so that would mean Nimrod, and the Kar is at the back, the hunter. His family originated from the land of Arata, that's in Merkar. Arata was towards the north in the Zagros Mountains, and that clearly corresponds to the biblical Ararat. It's the same name, you'll see the same things there. It's just slightly differently how the letters are grouped together. His father, that's in Merkar's father, was a man with the name of Meskiach Kaser. He was the one that migrated from the north after the flood, according to tradition. A name that may be shortened to Kash, which corresponds with that of Cush, the father of Nimrod. And there are many other agreements between these families in the biblical account and the Sumerian account. I just don't have the time. But on my blog, you can go and read. I have a more extensive discussion there of these families. There can't be any doubt that what we find in the Sumerian tradition, in the Sumerian king list, is exactly the same people that are referred to in the genealogy in the book of Genesis. They ruled a few generations after the great flood. That's exactly what we know about Nimrod and his kingdom. That's in Merkar's kingdom stretched from Uruk and Eridu in the south to the distant north to Arata. And what I'm arguing, I'll be arguing just now, is that Eridu is actually the biblical Bible. What about the Tower of Babel? Now, what is interesting in this early period that I'm discussing, Babylon was not on the map. Babylon played no role in that early period. Babylon only became important after the time of Abram, or about the same time, but slightly after Abram left Sumer and went to Canaan, when Hammurabi became king of Babel. Then that was when that became a very important city. Now, the later Babylonian priest Berosus, just like the biblical author, in my opinion, referred to Eridu under the name Babel. So when he referred to Eridu, he uses the name Babel, Berosus, in the Mesopotamian, the Babylonian priest. So what I'm arguing is that the biblical editor did exactly the same. Why would he do that? The reason is simple. Both Eridu and Babylon was written in the cuneiform script as Ninki. Now, this ki just means the place. So that we call it a determinative. It's just saying that this name is the name of a city. The name is actually Nun. So the name of Eridu and Babylon were written exactly the same in this ancient cuneiform text. So a later author, if we've seen this name, he would have immediately thought, okay, well, this is Babylon. But actually, it goes back earlier to Eridu, and that dates from the early Sumerian period. Eridu was a very important religious center. People from all over Sumer gathered to celebrate the festivals. It was known as the oldest sanctuary in ancient Sumer, the most famous in ancient Sumer. And in Merkar rebuilt this platform, this temple platform at Eridu. Exactly what we read, or what is, according to tradition, told about Nimrod. Eridu was rebuilt in the time of Merkar into a huge temple terrace. Okay, here's another map of Sumer. Let's focus in a slightly more detail on the land of Sumer. Here's the Persian Gulf. Here's the two rivers, Mesopotamia. It comes from Mesopotamos, the land of the two rivers. That's the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. The Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Now, the various towns we've talked about, or cities we talked about, there is Uruk, the city of Uruk, and slightly to the north, here is Nippur, it's another very important city, and over there is Kish, that we've also talked about. Itana was the first king of Kish. And Merkar ruled in Uruk. That was the only important city in ancient Sumer during the what we call Uruk period. Now here is Ur. That's the city where Abraham originated from. That was also the last city where the Sumerians ruled before the fall of the Sumerian, shall we say, can't really say civilization, but their rule when that came to an end. Now Eridu is just next to Ur. There it is situated. Here is a picture of the ruins as it looks today, ruins of Eridu. And here is an artist depiction. I hope you can see. I'm not sure if you can see, but over here you'll see it's just a big terrace, but it's not yet the ziggurat. The ziggurat came later in the historical period of Mesopotamia. What about the confusion of language? The Sumerian tradition also has something like this. It's called Nurimuts. That's in Ki. His spell. Now, this God in Ki, his name means N is Lord. Sometimes we find a Nun in the beginning, that means lady. But the Lord and Ki, I've just mentioned Ki in a different context. The determinative Ki, which means the place, here it means the land. So he's the Lord of the land. He was the great Sumerian God. And he stood over and against the supreme God. The supreme God ruled the heavens, and he ruled in the underworld and in the Apsu. Now listen to this. This is a translation of the ancient Sumerian text. This is a translation by Thorkild Jacobsen. In my opinion, he's the greatest of them all when it comes to Sumerian scholars. You agree with me, Johan? I'll say. He's also somebody that is doing his master's in one of Sumerian texts, so he knows something about that world. In the whole compass of heaven and earth, the people entrusted to him could address Enlil, that's the son of Am, the supreme God, verily in but a single tongue. But the Lord of Eridu, that's Enki, strangled the tongues in their mouths, as many as were put there, the tongues of men, which was one. The usual explanation is that the story describes the various languages of the world, how these languages came into being through a miraculous divine event. Suddenly God created all these languages. Is this correct? This is the usual view. What is interesting, the biblical genealogy just before in chapter 10 has a totally different account. There we read that this is the story preceding the Tower of Babel, that languages came into being as humans became dispersed over the earth. Now that's what we know. That's how languages are formed. So how can we describe or understand this problem? What we find is that two different words are used. The one word, the word that is used when humans became dispersed, that's a typical word for languages. That's in chapter 10 in this long genealogy. That's also the genealogy where mention is made of Nimrod and Cush, etc. The confusion of language or speech, in that case, the Hebrew word literally means lip, and it refers to speech in the way of pronunciation. How you pronounce the words with your lips. This is actually what is meant there. And what I propose is the convention of pronunciation changed with the introduction of phonetic writing at the end of the Uruk period. Right at the end of the Uruk period, that was when these great rulers, Meschi-Achkaz's family, ruled over the land of Sumer. At the end of that period, just slightly after Nimrod's rule, suddenly it happened. At that stage, it happened that phonetic writing was discovered by the Sumerians. They also discovered the wheel that we all use to this day quite extensively. They discovered it, and they also discovered phonetic writing. So at that stage, suddenly the symbols were being reused in a different way. Previously, it just referred to certain stuff, but now suddenly it was the pronunciation that was important. So when the different symbols were connected, placed next to each other, it was a way of pronouncing them. And suddenly the Sumerians would have been able to pronounce it, but the Semites and the Elamites and the other people that were living there, that would have been a total confusion. They wouldn't have known what it referred to, except if they were able to understand the Sumerian. So I believe that's where the confusion came from. So here is an outline of Sumerian history. What we have is the Ubaid period, about 6,000 to 3,000 BC. Early in that period is Adapa, which I identify with the biblical Adam. At the end of that period, I believe we should place Etana, the king of Kish. Why I place him there is a long story. You can go and read on my blog. I discussed that there in some length. I believe that he corresponds with Enoch. And then it's the deluge. That's when the great flood actually happened. And I take that to correspond with the 2.7 to 3.7 meter flood layer found in the ancient city of Ur by Sir Woolley. What is interesting about this flood layer is it divides the Sumerian world between the Ubaid period and the Uruk period. Now what we talk about in archaeology is the material culture. That's the representation that we find in the ground, in the dig, which is representative of that period. So it is a certain kind of art, certain kind of styles, everything. So what we find is this period's material culture is very different from this period. And the whole Sumeria, or the whole ancient Mesopotamian world, is divided by this flood layer. So that's good reason to believe that's where the great flood of Sumerian and biblical tradition fits into our story. Then came the Uruk period. Meschi-Achkaz migrated from Arata to settle in Sumer. He came from the northern mountains, the Zagros Mountains. The only place where this word Arata has been found is high up in the Zagros Mountains. Nowhere else. That's just all sorts of speculation. Cush came from Arata, Ararat to Sumer. That's exact. So what I'm saying is this account is the same as that Sumerian one. And Merkar built the city of Uruk and rebuilt Eridu in the same way that Nimrod ruled in Uruk and built the Tower of Babel according to tradition. So what I'm saying is Eridu, the large platform, temple platform at Eridu, is just exactly what the Bible is talking about as the Tower of Babel. Babel is just there, a late reworking of the text. At the end of this period, phonetic writing was discovered. That's when the confusion of languages, in my opinion, should be placed. And that just after that, Enme Baragesi, it was a great king of Kish. That was the first dynasty. He's of the second dynasty. He's the first historical person from ancient Mesopotamia of whom we have inscriptions. That makes sense because phonetic writing was just discovered just before that. His writing, we have 2 inscriptions from his period, are still straight lines. It's not yet the wedge type of cuneiform that were later typical of ancient Mesopotamia. It's also Gilgamesh, king of Kush. He also ruled in that period, but the stories of his rule dates much later. That's during the Jamnet Nesa period. Then came the early dynastic period. Various dynasties ruled over the city-states. And eventually, Sargon the Great was the one that founded the Akkadian Empire. At that stage, Sargon was a Semite, and he ruled over the Sumerians. He was one of the greatest kings of all time. And he was an archetype of a good ruler and a powerful ruler throughout Mesopotamian history. After this period, we have the Ur III period. The 3 means it was the 3rd dynasty that ruled in Ur. That was when the Sumerian Renaissance took place, when many texts were written down from the oral traditions of this early period. And then about 180 years or so later, we have the person of Abram arriving on the scene, traveling, migrating from Sumer to Canaan. So that's an overview of the history. So the question is, myth, legend, or history? The biblical account is consistent with a viable reconstruction of Sumerian history, as I've just shown you. From the time before the Great Flood until after the Uruk period, from the 6th to the early 3rd millennium BC. Not even found in Sumerian tradition. Not in Sumerian tradition, we don't have such an outline as we found have in the biblical tradition, where the ancient history of the land must be reconstructed from textual sources and from archaeological data. The obvious question is, how on earth did the biblical author know how to arrange his history, placing the personages in the correct historical context? How would he know that? If he wrote this late in the time of the Babylonian exile, how on earth would he know how to do it? It's impossible. So it does not make sense that the author wrote it down millenniums after these things happened without access to a continuous and reliable tradition. So that's where the Sumerian hypothesis comes in. I believe that these traditions were handed down through the ages, so it goes back to the ancient history of Sumer, which really happened, so it's grounded in history. It's not historical writing as we find later with the Greeks, Herodotus being the father of history writing, but it is definitely grounded in history. There cannot, I believe, be any doubt about that. Okay, so let's take a break. Okay, we are discussing the Sumerian hypothesis. This is the 4th lecture, and we're actually reconsidering chapters 1 to 12 in Genesis. So the main question is, can we still believe the Bible? We're considering it from the perspective of the ancient world from which the text originated. First talk was on Sumer and the Bible, then reconsidering the book of Genesis, myth, legend, or history, and now evidence or faith. So the question is, how was the primeval history handed down? How did it come, according to the Sumerian hypothesis, how did it come that this history was to be absorbed in the biblical text? How did it end up in the biblical text? For such a long period. Remember, we're talking about long periods in ancient Sumerian history. So what I'm saying is, what is important here is the Semitic oral tradition. We should consider this. The earliest texts, the earliest phonetic writing, was 3000 BC. Then the earliest a literary text were about 2500 BC. And the Sumerian Renaissance, when most of the texts were written down, it's about 2100 BC. Now, Adam goes back to 6000 BC, about, more or less, or Adapa. What is interesting is that the Semites had a long and a strong tradition of handing down stories orally. We find, for example, during the Akkadian period, that's at the end of the 3rd millennium BC, that Enheduanna, the daughter of the great king Sargon that I've mentioned in the previous lecture, in one of her poems, she says that this poem must be handed down verbatim, word by word. And she refers, in this Sumerian text, this word refers to the technical sense of memorizing and retelling stories word for word. So this is what's meant here. The poets must learn this poem by heart, and they must repeat it word by word, and that's the way they should hand it down. This is in the technical sense. So oral techniques should have formed an extremely important part of the education of early poets. In that early period, before the arrival of phonetic writing, the only way of making sure that something were handed down, some kind of story, was through the oral tradition. And that's why I think it's in that period that these techniques and so forth were developed. We find that the Akkadian epics of the great kings of Sargon, of Naram-Sin, which came slightly later, the 4th king, were handed down for centuries by poets before they were written down. There was strong oral tradition in Semitic circles. And we also find it much later in Hebrew tradition, where we read, for example, that something is written on the tables of the heart. So instead of writing on a cuneiform tablet, it's written on the heart. So they have the same thing in mind. In the same way that we write something down, it must be written on the heart, it must be memorized. So to this day, we find that the Jews would learn the whole Pentateuch. The Orthodox use the whole Pentateuch by heart. They'll know everything. And that's an ancient tradition being kept alive. Okay, so there was a strong oral tradition. That's how the Semites remembered these stories. So when was the primeval history written down? This early tradition that I've just spoken about in the previous lecture, chapters 4 to 11. When was it first written down? Now, the strong Sumerian influences without any Babylonian motives, I must repeat that and accentuate that, suggest that it was during Abrahamic times and that he came from Sumer, and that's why we find the strong Sumerian influence in this early part of Genesis. The close correspondence with the Sumerian king list suggests that it was during the time of Abram that this part of Genesis were written down. What is interesting there, in the Abrahamic tradition, we have lots and lots of oracles. Here is a list of oracles in the Abrahamic tradition. The Abrahamic tradition, to a large extent, is just oracle on oracle on oracle, God speaking to him, and there's some historical context as to how it happened. Now, this strongly suggests that this was the time when these things were written down. Why? These ancient peoples, especially the ancient Semites, regarded the oracles with great awe. They believed that when God spoke, these things should be written down. We, for example, find with the Akkadian kings, when they inquired about the view of the gods, they would, for example, kill a sheep or something. The priest would come and have a look at the liver, and then he would say, okay, the God says this. And when the God spoke, they would take this liver, and they would make a clay model, and they would write down what was the message. Because the God spoke. When the God spoke, it was considered with great awe, and it should be preserved for future generations. We also find in Mari, that's a city towards the western part of Mesopotamia, a city through which Abraham migrated, exactly in the period of Abraham, that there were some prophets of other gods, and they wrote down these oracles during that time. So that was the tradition, was to write down the oracles of the gods. It was not just when that happened, when the oracles of the gods were written down. So that's a very good argument, and a strong argument, why this string of oracles that we find in the Abrahamic tradition would also have been written down during the time when they were given. That's during the time of Abram. So if they were written down during that period, the story of Abram, the most logical way to think about it is that the oral tradition that was handed down in the family most probably were also written down during that period of Abram, as I've just argued. And this source material was handed down and written then by someone like Moses at a later stage. So Genesis 1 to 12. How should we view Genesis 1 to 12? We have good reasons to believe in a historical Abram. That's what we started with. We can't prove it beyond all doubt, but we have very good reasons, as I've shown. The strong Sumerian influence in the creation story suggests an early origin in Sumer, because there's no whatsoever, absolutely no influences from later periods, from the Babylonian period, in this part of the text. This is the ancient milieu from which Genesis 1 to 11 came, and the precise correspondence between Sumerian history shows that it's grounded in history. So what I believe is that the Abrahamic family brought the tradition with them from Ur and Sumer towards the land of Canaan, and that's how it eventually found its way into the Bible. What about evidence? So the main question is, do we have enough evidence to believe the biblical narrative? That's the question. Do we have enough evidence? Now, all evidence is interpreted. You know, when it comes to archaeology, I've just already mentioned it in the earlier lecture. But when you find something, one archaeologist said it so nicely, he said, when you find something and you have three archaeologists, they will have, all of them will have different views about how to interpret this particular item. This is typical in the archaeological perspective. Everybody has a different view about these things. So it's extremely difficult to decide that this is the one and final truth about these things. We just can't do that. Archaeology doesn't lend it to that. So it's impossible to prove such things. It's just not possible. Archaeology can't do that. But what we can do is to make a sensible and a convincing case. Let's take, for example, a court case. In a court case, we have a crime scene. There's a certain amount of data available to the court, and there are two narratives before the court. So the one narrative, that of the defense, and the other narrative, that of the state. Now, the judge must decide which is correct. Now, the only way to decide that is to look at the facts. But the facts are restricted, quite often is quite restricted. The crime scene just has that amount of facts. Now, if the court can't decide which of these two narratives is the correct one, then that person must be innocent, because the court can't make a decision. So we have something very similar. We don't have a final truth that we can work with. We have a viable narrative from the ancient world. And if we have a viable narrative, that's what we can work with. So when it comes to belief, one has to ask oneself, what do we want? What do we expect? I talked to a person a while ago. He said to me, wow, I need proof. But what is the kind of proof available? So you can want certain kind of proof, but if archaeology can't provide that kind of proof, you wait forever. You'll never find it, because it's an unrealistic expectation. The question is, what can we realistically expect? Okay. So it's about a sensible and a convincing case that should be made. So, evidence or faith? Should we first have the facts, or should we just believe? No, I believe we should have a reasonable case to believe. And I believe this is what I have presented. It's impossible to prove everything in the Bible. There's just not such evidence available. Not because those events didn't happen, but because evidence is scarce. So it's about the reach of archaeology. We can make a viable case that the stories in Genesis is grounded in history, in my opinion. And this is in accordance with the Sumerian hypothesis. So I believe we can take this as a trustworthy account of the early period, and that this material were brought by the Abrahamic family from ancient Sumer towards the land of Canaan, and eventually it entered the book of Genesis, most probably by an author like Moses in an early period, but not in a late period, such as after the Babylonian exile. If it was written after the Babylonian exile, it would just be stories told about around campfires. It would have no truth, it's just stories. But if it's been delivered from an ancient oral tradition, written down very early, we have good reason to believe that it's grounded in history, these stories. Now, if that's true, if we can believe the Bible to the extent that I'm describing, that is possible with available evidence before us, then we'll have to ask ourselves, what do we do with the Bible? How do we consider the Bible? The Bible is, after all, not only a book about history, it's also a book about faith. So, after a lecture such as that, the 4 lectures I have given tonight, one should ask oneself, we have only one life. And in this life, we have to make certain decisions, difficult decisions. And one of these is regarding faith. So I'll leave you with this question. Just consider, in the terms of tonight's lecture, come to consider this question of faith. Should I believe? Shouldn't I believe? Do I have enough evidence? What is the kind of evidence that I need to believe? And is it enough? Maybe it is enough. Okay, thank you very much.